Hey everybody, welcome back to history class. These next couple of episodes are not going to be based on the fill in the blank notes. They're extras, stuff where you can get a ton of really good information from somebody who cares a lot about this sort of thing. To start with, I will reveal a little secret. The egg that I used in yesterday's lecture, I ate it this morning, and it did not taste like a cathedral dome. It was wonderful. So, just in case you were wondering what happened to that egg. And another interesting little side point, some of you have asked if I went to Curry College. The answer is no, but they make a really good mug. So, today, what are we talking about? We're talking about Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was the first of the great artists of what we call the High Renaissance, the period where all the major changes had already really started to develop from the medieval period into the Renaissance period. There are some stories about Leonardo da Vinci's birth and his early years. Some of them involve the fact that his dad was a nobleman, but his mom was not the nobleman's wife. Apparently what happened was Leonardo's dad was a player, and so he had relations with several of the servants, I guess. Definitely fell in love with this one servant girl that he had, and they had Leonardo da Vinci, the kid. Leonardo da Vinci's dad didn't do what a lot of guys do, fortunately, but a lot of guys, unfortunately. A lot of guys will walk away from that scenario or just pay the bills and not have much to do with the kid. In Leonardo's case, his dad was very engaged and interested in his life, sent him to the best schools, played the role of an attentive, loving father, which is great for Leonardo and great for the world because we get one of the best artists of all time out of it. So, Leonardo da Vinci. In his youth, there's a legend, I don't think it's proven, but there's a legend that, going back to yesterday's egg, that Leonardo da Vinci was a young man who assisted Brunelleschi in building the dome in Florence, the Duomo, and that from observing Brunelleschi, maybe up close, maybe from afar, just seeing how Brunelleschi was tackling a lot of issues, solving a lot of architectural problems, being inventive and creative, that this was actually a real inspiration for Leonardo da Vinci, probably one of the most inventive and creative artists that there's ever been anywhere. So, Leonardo da Vinci, what are we talking about? He trained under some of the great artists of the early Renaissance. He probably worked for Brunelleschi building the dome. And when it came time for him to start his own career, interestingly enough, he didn't really think, and he was right, he didn't really think that he could make it just saying, I'm an artist. Not that he wasn't talented enough, but that rulers and people with money were a little conservative and cautious at that point about who they were going to invest their money in. So when Leonardo da Vinci put around job applications, he technically applied with dukes and rulers of Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa and Siena, Florence, Milan, Parma, all the great northern city-states. He actually put on his application that what he was looking for was jobs designing fortresses. He would be an engineer, an architect of city requirement kind of buildings, stuff you needed to keep everybody safe. And he also put at the bottom, and I can do art too. So one of his first big jobs was he made a statue, mounted statue on horseback of a duke of one of the cities. And it was really, really a famous statue. Unfortunately, it was destroyed later in history. People melted it down to make musket balls and cannonballs. So, always a good move. But that was one of his first great pieces. From then on, he really did start to get the attention of a lot of Italy's greatest rulers and started working for them. He traveled everywhere. He got a reputation. He became art's first superstar, someone who was able to hang around with dukes and princes and kings and queens just from the virtue of his artistic talent. Somebody who wasn't considered a workman, but somebody who was considered a social leader purely for his art skills. Kind of cool. So he's the first art superstar and the first of the three great high Renaissance artists. I've got a book about Leonardo da Vinci's artwork. I have many books about them, but unfortunately a lot of them are at school. If you want to know what Leonardo da Vinci looked like in his older years, there's a self-portrait Leonardo da Vinci made, a sketch of himself. Interesting piece. Old and shaggy. If you want to see his first real masterpiece, what a lot of people consider the first of his great works, it's this. There's the Virgin Mary, and she's being told by the angel Gabriel that she's been chosen to be God's wife and that she's going to bear God's son. So, story out of the Bible for you. Now, interesting about this piece, you will perhaps remember that it goes way, way back in the background. There's mountains back here in the foggy distance. So the use of perspective, the use of blurring the background, really interesting and important if you want to create realistic 3D images. The angel Gabriel here, there's been a lot of criticism from art historians about the wings. Like, they don't really attach like birds' wings do, but they don't really attach like angels' wings are thought to attach. So there's a lot of art historians who think that's an area where he really could have worked on this piece, maybe designing it a little better before he put paint to canvas. Also, there's tons, you may not be able to make it out really well, but there's huge amounts of flowers down here in the lawn. Every one of them is a different variety of flower. Every one gets its own portrait, almost like a spotlight shown on it, being beautiful and unique. There's another couple of interesting things about this painting that hold it back from being Leonardo da Vinci's very best. One of them is the Virgin Mary's hand. The way that she reaches out, the arm seems to extend unnaturally long from her body, and the fingers kind of go out at this really awkward kind of angle. Must have been very uncomfortable for the model, perhaps, if he used a model in that. And another thing is, she looks like she's got 3 legs. It's kind of weird. She's got her 2 legs, but then she's got the robe, the dress that she's in, draped across the back of her chair. But Leonardo da Vinci hasn't made the chair back high enough, maybe, to differentiate it really clearly from her 2 legs. And so you have to wonder, is this like an arachnid version of the Virgin Mary? Is she a spider with more than just 2 legs? So it's an interesting, fun little piece to dissect by Leonardo da Vinci. And that was done in the mid-1470s. Later on, Leonardo da Vinci did another really important piece, one that's considered a masterpiece of his, in the 1490s. At this point, he had become an art superstar, and rich people were coming to him begging for him to make art for them. This is called the Virgin of the Rocks, and it's the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. And in addition to that, there's an angel and Jesus' cousin, John. So this piece covers one thing that's absolutely essential about Italian Renaissance art, which is the use of a triangle as an important shape in a painting. Now, the thing is that if you want a painting to be solid and stable, you would have a flat line going across, right? If you want a painting to be exciting and dynamic, you might have vertical lines going in a painting, because the vertical line could like tip over. So you have the stable and you have the dynamic. What would do it better than anything else to combine those? Making a triangular image in your painting, because the vertical can look like it's tipping in both directions, but you still have the stability of the base, and a triangle is relatively stable, but it's still exciting and dynamic. So the triangle that's involved here is the Virgin Mary's eyes. If you go from the Virgin Mary's eyes, she's looking down at Jesus. And Jesus, oh, I'm sorry. No, that's John. That's cousin John. The Virgin Mary's looking down at John, and you can see her arm in a robe makes that line down to John. John is praying to the baby Jesus, who's got his hand up in a blessing. He's giving John a blessing. And you go up from the baby Jesus, because he's got somebody behind him, that angel, and then you follow her eye back to the Virgin Mary. So you've got a classic Italian Renaissance triangle here. In addition, you've got the background, this amazing, bizarre background, like they're deep in some grotto or some cave. All in all, it's a really interesting painting. Leonardo da Vinci made 3 copies of it, I think. One of them is in Florence, one of them is in Paris, and one of them is in London. How did Leonardo da Vinci get so good at painting the human body? Painting us, muscles, and the bone structure underneath, our skeletal structure. Well, the Catholic Church was not okay at this time in history with autopsies, right? If a person dies, according to the Catholic Church in the Italian Renaissance, you leave their body alone because they're going to go into the afterlife with that body. They need it in heaven. Or if they're buried, then what happens is when Jesus comes down to bring everybody up to heaven in the end, he's going to bring their bodies out. So you can't have stitch marks and stuff from autopsies. Well, Leonardo da Vinci didn't really follow all the rules. He went to the morgues, where all the dead bodies were being held before they were buried, and he would bribe the people in charge of the morgues in the middle of the night to be able to perform autopsies. And he'd bring sketchbooks, and he would do sketches of people's dead bodies pulled apart so that he could get a sense of what muscle goes where, what's on top of what, how the skeletal structure really is, in order to make realistic paintings of the human body in motion. So, an important, interesting thing about Leonardo da Vinci. Another interesting thing about Leonardo da Vinci, his sexuality. He never married, never had women in his life in that way that we know of. We don't know of any particular men in his life in that way either, except there appears to be, from the city records of Florence, a few occasions where Leonardo da Vinci was arrested for being in the wrong place at the wrong time at night, at pickup spots where homosexual men hung out sometimes. Leonardo da Vinci was rounded up with a number of men at these locations. However, charges were never pressed against him, probably because he had some friends in high places who were able to get him out of jail without going through the court system afterwards. But, interestingly, Leonardo da Vinci's work in his sketchbooks about the human body led to one of the most famous sketches of the human body ever. This is called the Vitruvian Man. And this actually went up in outer space. We sent up a satellite and spaceship. I think it was one of the early Apollos. It was unmanned. And we sent this picture up in it so that when aliens first encounter something that's human-made, they'll know that planet Earth is inhabited by creatures that look like this. So, human beings. Leonardo da Vinci has taken the human body and put it in the 2 perfect forms here. The square. You'll notice that if his arms are outstretched flat, and the feet are kept flat, that the human body forms a square. But if you take the legs and put them outward, and you do the same with the arms, it forms a perfect circle. So human beings make up the circle and the square. That sketch, as far as we know, is from the year 1490. So, Leonardo da Vinci probably is most famous for 2 particular pieces that we'll talk about now. One of them is The Last Supper. These monks in Milan asked Leonardo da Vinci if he would paint them, obviously for payment. The cafeteria wall in their monastery. So he came in, and now we haven't talked about frescoes yet, I don't think. So we need to talk for a minute about fresco. Fresco is an Italian word that literally means fresh. But in this case, when you're talking about a fresco painting, you're talking about a painting that's done onto a wall, but not a dry wall. You plaster the wall first. You're replastering the wall, but you don't do the entire wall at once. You do a segment of it, and then you paint on it while it's still wet. Because if you paint on a dry wall, the paint is going to flake off in time due to moisture and due to the fact that it's not really part of the wall, it's just on the wall. But if you do a fresco, then you have a painting that is part of that wall permanently, because the paint is absorbed by the plaster when it dries, and so it just literally is the wall. You have to chip it off to get rid of the painting. So Leonardo da Vinci was asked if he would do a fresco painting for these monks in their cafeteria in Milan. He decided he was going to try out some new technology that he had. He thought he had some incredible paint that would force itself into the plaster, that would go deep, that would sink itself in even on a dry wall. And so he painted the Last Supper onto a dry wall instead of being a technically correct fresco. This is the Last Supper. I'm sure you've seen it. Jesus is in the center. Now, whenever we see Jesus, whenever we see holy figures in Italian Renaissance and in medieval art, we see them with a halo around their head. In this case, and he's in the centerfold, so it's not easy to see, but in this case, Jesus does not have a halo of light. Instead, Jesus is in the middle of a window. And so this Last Supper has Jesus getting a natural glow around him, a natural halo instead of a supernatural halo. Interesting, this is the first major Last Supper painting. There were hundreds before this, but this is the first major Last Supper painting to have everybody on the same side of the table. It was considered the norm in the medieval period and the early Renaissance to have the traitor of the Last Supper, the guy who sells out Jesus, to be the only person sitting on the wrong side of the table. That way you can clearly delineate who is Judas, the one who sells out Jesus. Instead, for this piece, he makes Judas the only person of all the disciples who is facing away, so that you can't, right over here. This is Judas right here. You can't see his face. He's turned completely to the other guys. And in his hand, he's got a bag of gold, the gold that he's getting for turning in Jesus. Interestingly, 3s and 4s, the number 3 and the number 4, play a huge role in this painting. You'll notice that there's 3 windows in the back, 3 lit windows, but there's 4 side panels on each side. There's 12 disciples plus Jesus. Each of the disciples is in a cluster of 3. And because there's 12 of them, there are 4 clusters. Cluster number 1 right here, cluster number 2 right here, cluster number 3 right here, and cluster number 4 over here. Each cluster has got 3 disciples, 3 times 4. So the 3s and the 4s are really important here. What's the story of this piece, though? The history of this piece after it was made, the monks, you'll notice right here, this is a real doorway. They decided to install a doorway underneath the painting and take out Jesus' feet. Jesus' feet would have been here in the original painting. But shortly after it was completed, the monks decided to just get rid of that part of the painting. Unfortunately, even before Leonardo da Vinci died, it was clear that his attempt to make a fresco on dry plaster had failed. The paint was starting to chip and flake away already. There have been several times in history where art historians have gone in to try to clean it, and instead, because the technology they had at their hands at that time in history wasn't good enough, instead they damaged the Last Supper. That happened on at least 2 occasions. Recently, within the last 40 years or so, art historians have gone in with proper chemicals and done the work that they needed to. So that's the Last Supper. On one last little side note, it was actually damaged badly in the 1800s when Napoleon invaded the city of Milan. Napoleon was leading an anti-French Revolution movement to overthrow the revolution. His men were anti-religious. The Catholic Church had dominated France for so long, and his men actually took musket shots and chipped away at the painting with their bayonets too. So when they captured Milan, they were so anti-religious that they did damage to the painting The Last Supper. Now you're probably wondering when I'm going to get to this one. This is the last thing we're going to do on Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa. Okay, the Mona Lisa is hugely famous. It might be the most famous painting on planet Earth. And to be honest, I've seen it 4 or 5 times. It's never been that good to me. But, you know, you can't argue with 4 billion people. So, what's the deal with the Mona Lisa? We call it the Mona Lisa, as do people in England. People in France and Spain call it La Gioconda. So why the difference? Well, the woman's name is Lisa Gioconde. Her husband was Mr. Gioconde. He was a merchant, and he was working. He decided to get a portrait done of his wife and hired Leonardo da Vinci to paint it. It's an unfinished piece. He actually never gave it to the guy who paid for it. Instead, when he decided to leave Italy at the end of the Italian Renaissance, when things were going quite badly, Leonardo da Vinci got an offer from the King of France, Francis I. Come live with us. You come to France. Bring all of your possessions with you. You don't have a wife. You don't have kids. You should be fine. Just move to France. I'll keep you safe. Now, the thing was that Italy at this point, there were lots of civil wars. The city-states were attacking each other. Art had become less important. The Italian Renaissance was dying. And so Leonardo da Vinci took the offer. He moved to France and became the King of France's royal painter. For the rest of his life, he worked for Francis, painted whatever the king wanted, lived in the royal palace with the king, had all of the luxuries of being a member of the royal family. But the big condition was that when he died, the painting, all of the paintings that he had, all of his unfinished work would become property of the King of France. So that's what happened. When Leonardo da Vinci died, all of his stuff that he took with him, that he left Italy with, became French royal property. And that's why you can go see a lot of Leonardo da Vinci's best stuff in the Louvre Museum in Paris, because that's the royal museum of the kings of France back when they still had kings. So the Mona Lisa, she's got that grin, that Mona Lisa smile that's so famous. Well, the thing is, it's kind of mysterious. It's a little bit of a grin in the corners of her mouth, but we're not really sure. The thing is that Leonardo da Vinci used a technique called chiaroscuro, where he blurred the corners. He put a little bit of like chalk, black charcoal maybe on his fingers, and smudged the corners to give the impression of dark shadows in the corners of her mouth. And it gives us that impression of a grin or a Mona Lisa smile. She's wearing a veil over her hair. A lot of people don't realize it, but there's a thin black line underneath her hairline. It's all a veil. Her hair really is there. She's got dark hair and everything, but there's a thin black veil covering her head. She's got no eyebrows. It was popular for upper-class women at this time to pluck their eyebrows completely. I guess the men found that kind of a turn-on. But either way, the Mona Lisa has no eyebrows. She's got eyes that seem to follow you no matter where you go in the room. These are all some of the reasons why the Mona Lisa has become famous and popular as a painting. But one of the biggest reasons, two of the biggest reasons really, are because of its placement in the Louvre. The Mona Lisa wasn't really all that popular until postcards became popular. There was no such thing as a postal system in Europe until around 1840. Queen Victoria of England was the first monarch to approve a government postal service. So when the French adopted the English style of being able to mail things, the museums wanted to become popular, and so they made postcards, pre-printed postcards. And the Louvre Museum wanted people to come and visit the museum. Leonardo da Vinci was a famous artist, and so they took a Leonardo da Vinci painting that they had of his, the Mona Lisa, and they put it on thousands and thousands of postcards, and then they sold those to the public. And these postcards became really, really popular, and that popularized the Mona Lisa. Another reason the Mona Lisa has become popular is because it was the first major piece to ever be the victim of an art theft. Little over 100 years ago, the painting went missing, and everybody scoured for it all over the world. They took in people who had spent a little bit too much time studying it when they visited the Louvre. One of the guys who was arrested and questioned about it was a Spanish painter, a young Spanish painter who was trying to study the great masters. Nobody important, though, only Pablo Picasso. So the police arrested this young Spaniard, Pablo Picasso, thinking that he might have been a person who had studied the Mona Lisa to the point of wanting to steal it. He didn't have it. In reality, what had happened was one of the janitors at the Louvre Museum was Italian, and he was upset that Italy's most famous painting by Italy's most famous artist was stuck in France. And so he quit his job, served out his 2-week notice, and the last night that he worked, he cut the Mona Lisa out of its frame, smuggled it out of the building, and then left France completely. He went to Italy. And a couple of years later, he was caught trying to sell it to an Italian art dealer, I think. And so the Mona Lisa was returned to its rightful place in the Louvre Museum, but the notoriety it had gotten was just massively huge. So, the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci died in the 1500s after spending the last several years of his life working for the King of France. Another great thing about Leonardo da Vinci that's worth talking about is his inventions. If you take a look at his sketchbooks, he appears to have invented tanks, battlefield tanks, to have invented airplanes. Now, helicopters even. But the thing is that none of his inventions actually worked. And none of his inventions were actually the sketches of his inventions. None of them were ever used in actually designing the actual final products that we have today. So was he a visionary? Yes. Did he maybe look into the future of technology? Yes. Did he actually influence these things by drawing them in a sketchbook that nobody ever saw until several hundred years after his death, and nobody ever really made designs from afterwards? No. But still, pretty interesting and pretty cool from one of the world's very best artists of all time. So that's been Leonardo da Vinci. Next time, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Thanks.